Welcome to How Temperature and Elevation Shape Birds Across Geographic Space and a Changing Climate, presented by Dr. Casey Youngflesh. Dr. Casey Youngflesh is a quantitative ecologist and presidential postdoctoral fellow in ecology, evolution, and behavior at Michigan State University. His research, broadly speaking, seeks to understand population and community level ecological processes across environmental gradients. He is interested in the role that cross-scale interactions between biotic and abiotic factors, play in shaping these dynamics and how these contribute to observed patterns of biodiversity. He approaches this work through the lens of global change and ultimately aims to understand and predict which species might be most sensitive to the impact of these changes. Dr. Youngflesh's research takes a cross-disciplinary approach, applying statistical and computational tools to integrate large-scale data streams from a variety of sources, including citizen science projects, satellite-based sensors, remote camera networks, and field-based efforts.
Well, thanks for that introduction. Very happy to be here to speak with all of you. Thanks for coming by and tuning in via Zoom. Great to see everyone here. Again, my name is Casey Youngflesh, postdoc at Michigan State University currently, although much of this work was done while I was at UCLA. So just some acknowledgements there. Before I really dive into things, I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors on this work, Morgan Tingley at UCLA, as well as Jim Sirocco and Rodney Siegel at the Institute of Bird Populations. And of course, I'd like to also acknowledge IBP, the MAPS team there, and really especially all the banding station operators that are out there collecting these data. Probably a number of you in the audience have been involved with MAPS in some way or another. So everything I'm presenting here is really relies on data collected as a part of MAPS over the last 30 years. So this literally couldn't have been possible without all these MAP stations being operated over this time period. So yeah, big thanks to all you folks. So I'll be talking to you today about bird morphology, the size and the shape of birds. While MAPS wasn't necessarily designed to look at morphology per se, avian productivity and survivorship is in the name, it's really an incredible resource for understanding these patterns. So morphology, of course, plays an important role in ecological systems. It's both a cause as well as a consequence of how organisms interact with their environment. So studying morphological variation over time and space provides a mechanism by which to understand really how organisms are shaped by their environments. Now, of course, there's been a lot of work in this area focused on morphological differences among species. These differences can be quite pronounced. A cardinal is very different from a condor. But morphology also varies quite a lot within the species. We tend to think of species as these monolithic entities, or maybe subspecies as monolithic entities. But really, that's not the case here. So the abiotic, biotic conditions that organisms experience that might shape morphology, that's actually going to vary quite a bit over species ranges. So temperature, for example, shows substantial variation over latitude, areas near to the poles, generally being colder, of course. And given the importance of body size for thermal regulation, we might expect animals to generally be larger at higher latitudes. So larger animals have smaller surface area to volume ratios, which means they're going to lose less body heat due to things like convection. So if you're a large person standing out in the cold, you're likely to be able to stand those chilly temperatures for longer than your perhaps smaller friend. I'm sure many of you can relate to this. I know I certainly can. So this notion that there might be this gradient in body sizes across latitude because of this, these thermal processes, that's commonly known as Bergmann's rule, after Carl Bergmann, who first formalized this idea a number of years ago now. So these proposed associations between temperature and body size over space, really over latitude, they've been used to motivate hypotheses for how species are likely to respond to warming temperatures, to global change. So given the rapid increases in global temperature that we've seen over the last half century or so, it's been suggested that species are really declining in size, that they're shrinking. However, the extent to which this is true, that there's a robust relationship between temperature and body size over either space or time, is somewhat unclear. So Bergmann's rule's been debated in the literature really since it was first proposed about 170 years ago, and broad evidence in support of changes over time has really been limited by a lack of taxonomic and spatial replication. So a number of studies that have looked at this in the past have focused on maybe just a few sites and or species. So we're really looking to scale that up and trying to have this holistic understanding of what's going on here. And of course, other abiotic behavioral factors no doubt play important roles in shaping morphology over time and space as well. So for flying organisms like birds, wing size, wing shape are likely to be driven by factors for flight. So for example, we might expect wing size to vary over an elevational gradient as air tends to be less dense at higher elevations. So longer wings might be needed to maintain flight in these environments, as that thin air environment at these high elevation environments might reduce the amount of lift that a wing provides. But again, the extent to which this is actually borne out in nature, that's currently unknown. So to answer some of these questions, we turn to data from MAPS, this large-scale bird banding project run by Institute for Bird Populations. So each dot on this map is a map station. So we use data from more than 1,100 banding stations over a 30-year period, somewhere around 1990 to present. So we considered only adult male birds here to avoid any confounding factors of age and sex here. But even after that filtering, we had over 250,000 captures of birds on their breeding grounds from over 100 species, most of these being songbirds, near songbirds. So we're interested in characterizing really how and why the size and shape of North American birds varies over space and time. As part of the MAPS protocol, as many of you probably know, mass and wing length measurements are taken of each bird captured in a net. Now, these two traits, wing length and mass, they're related to one another, right? So heavier birds would be expected to have larger wings. So any change over in wing length over space and time, that might simply be due to changes in body mass and vice versa. So to decouple these two metrics, we derive two morphological indices. So based on what we know about scaling rules in the natural world, we don't expect wing length to scale with mass 1-to-1. We actually expect wing length to change as the cube root of mass. So this is what's called a power law relationship. So this equation says wing length W is proportional to mass M to the 1/3 power, or the cube root of mass. So this is one of those scaling rules that we see widely in nature. And just to give you some intuition about this 1/3 relationship, if we think about a cube, one side of that cube is a linear measure. It's one dimension, and that is equal to the cube root of the volume of the cube, our three-dimensional measure. So if we wanted to get the volume of the cube, that's length times length times length, that's length cubed. So if we were to increase the size of this cube by 1 unit, we'd have a 4x4 block instead of a 3x3 block. Mass is 4 cubed rather than 3 cubed here. So if we think of wing length as the linear measure, as just one side of this cube here, and mass as a three-dimensional measure, since it's proportional to volume, it allows us to sort of build some intuition why we might expect to see this relationship. But that's just an expectation, of course. What do we actually see in the data here? Well, using a phylogenetic model to look at this relationship, we actually do find this relationship between wing length and mass to be almost exactly 1/3 across species. So this empirical relationship here matches up with our theoretical expectation, which is really nice to see. And this is really our null expectation of how wing length should change with mass. So I won't go into the details here, but essentially using this relationship, this expectation of how wing length should change with mass, we derive these morphological indices from wing length and mass measures. So that leaves us with these two indices. Really what we're interested in here, the size index. So that's a measure of the overall size of birds, big bird, little bird, but it's the same shape essentially. And the wing index, and that is a measure of relative wing length. Call this the winginess of the bird, if you will. So taking into account the bird's mass, how large are its wings, essentially. So there is a size index and a wing index value for every individual bird that's captured in a MAPS net. And then quantified how these indices varied over latitude, over elevation, over time, as well as spatial and temporal variation in temperature. So looking at variation in size over latitude, we find that individuals are generally larger at higher latitudes. So this is within species that we're looking at right now. So that is the positive slope of all these lines is indicating, well, at higher latitudes, we have larger sizes here. So each gray line is a species here. So 105 species, I believe it was. And the cross species, sort of the average effect across all of these birds that we looked at, that's shown in the thick black line here. So these results are in line with Bergman's rule, really what we might expect given what we know about thermal tolerances, since higher latitudes are generally colder. But what effect does temperature actually play in this variation across space? You could imagine a scenario that, okay, well, at 40 degrees latitude, you have a very cold environment, maybe because it's on a mountaintop or something like that. Maybe better to look at actual effects of temperature. We can go ahead and do that. We see that within species, again, individuals are typically smaller in the warmer portions of their range. So the temperature that we use here, it's May to July temperature at each of these map stations. This red box here, that is representing all the points on the y-axis that fall below 0. And that's essentially telling us that, well, within species, populations in the warmer portions of their range tend to be smaller than the colder portions of their range. So each point is a species here. But really more than that, we see that those species that experience warmer average temperatures, sort of at a range Y level, those show a stronger response to temperature compared to species that experience cooler temperatures. So that's indicated by the negative slope of this red line here. So not only is temperature related to body size, the magnitude of this effect, how much it really matters, that varies among species according to the thermal conditions that those species experience. So really there's all this variation that we see in these responses. So if we then look at variation in size over time rather than space, we see the body size is generally decreasing over the last several decades here. So as before, each gray line is a species here with the cross species or community average shown in black. But again, we can ask the question, is temperature driving these patterns through time? Of course, there are a lot of things changing over the last 30 years or so. Is this actually driven by temperature? Well, we find that fluctuations in temperature over time are indeed associated with changes in body size. So again, warmer temperatures, you have smaller individuals. And we see this effect for temperature in the year that the bird was captured, as well as 1 year prior to capture, but not 2 years prior to capture. So here we see In yellow here, this sort of yellowish orange, this is the effect of temperature in the year of capture. So higher temperatures here in a given year for a given site, smaller individuals. Lag 1 here is shown in pink, and lag 2 is shown here in this purplish hue. Now, the reason we don't see an effect at 2 years prior is probably because many of the individuals that we captured are actually, they actually didn't experience these temperatures 2 years prior. That is, they were second-year birds, so kind of makes sense on the not seeing an effect of lag 2 temperature there. It is interesting, however, that we see the effect of temperature in the year of capture here. So, 1 year prior to capture, you might say, okay, well, that was temperature that bird experienced during development. Maybe there was some process that, okay, it was a very warm egg, a very warm juvenile bird in the nest, nestling. Okay, it just ended up as a smaller adult. But we also see the effect of temperature in the year of capture. So we think there may be some size-dependent mortality for these birds in some of these years. So that is, during migration or the breeding season, larger birds may be experiencing higher rates of mortality in these warmer years. That's kind of what that's suggesting. Taking this one step further, though, within species, populations in warmer regions show a stronger temperature response compared to populations in cooler regions. So this is for red-eyed vireo here. Black is the breeding range of red-eyed vireo. And the white lines here, those are isoclines for the maximum temperature from May to July. So here we have the sort of 34 degrees Celsius region, 30 degrees Celsius region, and so forth, sort of getting colder as you expect as we move northward, with the warmest temperatures being experienced here in sort of the southeast US. So each dot here is a map station where red vireo was captured. And the deeper red hues, those indicate that temperature is having a larger effect on body size in these areas. So again, higher temperatures, smaller birds. So we see a stronger effect of temperature in these warm regions, even within a species. And so this is just for red-eyed vireo, but this is generally what we see across all species in our study. And this really tells us it's likely the hottest rather than the coldest temperatures that are driving these changes in body size. So essentially, it's a cooling down problem rather than a warming up problem. And this really provides widespread support for Bergmann's rule over both space and time. So that is, colder temperatures mean larger bodies, all else being equal. And that's true whether we're comparing temperature differences between Minnesota and Florida, or between 1990 and 2020. Interestingly, though, we find that the effects of a 1 degree change in temperature over space are actually quite a bit larger than the effects of a 1 degree change in temperature over time. So the average response over space is about twice as large as the response over time. So while we might say, okay, the fact that birds are getting smaller over time might suggest that species are actually adapting to climate change. So it's a good thing. But because of this difference in the response, like how large this response is to temperature, this actually highlights that these birds probably aren't adapting fast enough. So there might be some constraint on how rapidly body size can change. These sorts of processes can only operate so quickly, of course. If it's an evolutionary process, that can be quite slow. So the declines in overall mass over the study period was less than 1% if you average across all species. It's about up to 3% for some of the more rapidly changing species, which doesn't really sound like a lot. But remember, this is only a 30-year period. So that's actually quite a substantial amount of change and sort of in line with some of the rapid changes we've seen in a number of other taxa. And so while the ecological consequences of these changes are really unknown at this point, the importance of body size for life history traits, physiology, interactions, both within a trophic level, maybe competition, or across trophic levels, so maybe something like predator-prey interactions, that suggests the importance of these changes in body size could be far-reaching. particularly considering these birds might not be changing actually rapidly enough. And of course, given projected changes in temperature, we do expect these changes to continue into the future. We expect these species to continue to get smaller as the climate continues to warm. So if we now consider the wing index, the winginess of these species, within species, we see that birds do actually have relatively longer wings at higher elevations. It's quite a strong signal here. For some species, wings are actually about 10% longer at the highest elevations of their range compared to the lowest elevations of their range. So it's actually pretty dramatic. And even despite it being colder at these higher elevations, on mountaintops, birds are actually not larger there. They just have longer wings. So if any of you have spent any time at altitude, you'll know that the difference in air density compared to sea level can be pretty notable. There are literally fewer molecules in a parcel of air, which makes breathing more difficult. There's just not as much oxygen. There's not as many any air particles to breathe in there. And that same sort of point that there's fewer air molecules, that actually reduces the amount of lift that a wing can provide. So this reduced air density is actually, something of concern for helicopter pilots at high altitudes. Certain helicopters generally aren't flown above certain altitudes because of this problem, because of the reduced lift that you get in these thin air environments. And so these longer wings are likely some sort of compensatory response to this reduced air density. So these longer wings provide more lift. Now, the notion that birds have longer wings at higher elevations was documented some time ago. However, wing length was always taken to be an indicator of body size, which is not the case. Birds actually are not larger at higher elevations, despite it being colder there. They just have these longer wings. So what we show here is actually the first large-scale cross-taxonomic documentation of this ecomorphological gradient. So this nearly universal increase in relative wing length with elevation, which we think is pretty cool. So based on the relationships that we found, this is what the predicted northern parula wing index looks like. You can see a clear signal of longer wings throughout the Appalachians here. It's the breeding range of the species. You'll also notice, though, that in this case, longer wings are predicted at these more northerly latitudes. Now, these aren't necessarily areas of higher elevation. So for any of you that have spent some time in these areas, you'll know that, well, yeah, there's not much topography in many of these areas at all. So for some species, populations at higher latitude are actually likely to have longer migration distances compared to populations at lower latitudes. So this is the result of leapfrog migration patterns that we sometimes see. So essentially populations that breed the furthest north are actually those that overwinter the furthest south. Or alternatively, species where the southerly populations are resident while the rest of the species range is migratory. So in some of these species that we know to exhibit leapfrog migration, or where some populations are resident in part of the range, we actually see this important latitude come out. So the larger wings at higher elevations. And this includes Wilson's warbler, fox sparrow, eastern towhee's resident part of its range. But really, when you get right down to it, the truth of the matter is that we don't know a lot about the migratory patterns of a lot of these species. That is, how migration might vary over a single species range. And this is really something we hope to eventually get at. So all of what I just showed you should be published here in the next couple weeks or so. A PDF copy will be up on my website once it's out. If you don't have some sort of institutional access and you're interested, yeah, please check it out there. We have all the species-specific estimates, the details of how we analyze the data. That'll all be included there. But really, I think the takeaway for me for this work, what I think is interesting, is how this illustrates that there are a number of non-mutually exclusive processes that are acting in concert to shape the morphology of these birds over space and time. There are, of course, other factors not considered in this work that play an important role that we're really hoping to get at with future work, and characterizing these avian morphoscapes, essentially how morphology varies over space and time. So moving forward, we're really looking to continue to explore how and why birds look differently across their ranges. We want to understand the eco-evolutionary dynamics that shape these avian communities. So here is a sort of preliminary morphoscape for Acadian flycatcher over its breeding range, just to give you a sense of how a trait might vary across space. The yellow hues here are longer wings, the purple hues are shorter wings. All the dots are map stations. You can see there's a lot of variation here across the range of the species that actually isn't accounted for by just latitude and elevation here. So for this species, we have this region here, very short wings, Louisiana, East Texas. And that's really about the same latitude over here as, Georgia, South Carolina, maybe, that have much longer wings. So plenty of interesting things to explore here that we haven't quite dug into. These differences might have to do with differences in habitat types, different wintering locations for these populations. For some species, we might have good information about, why these sorts of patterns emerge, but for many, we certainly do not. So one thing that we hope to look at is the impact of habitat structure on morphology. So this could be something like, land cover type, is it maybe an agricultural area, is it really densely forested? I think that vegetation density might play quite an important role here. So birds might need to be more maneuverable in more densely vegetated habitats. So I'm interested in exploring this, how habitat structure influences wing length, for instance, which is going to impact maneuverability. We might expect individuals in more densely vegetated areas to have shorter wings, so they can navigate that spatially complex environment. And this sort of vegetation structure information, we now get this through sources such as JEDI, which is a new NASA spaceborne LiDAR that has global coverage now. So on the left is a LiDAR image of a forest. You can actually see the trees there. So LiDAR, for those who aren't familiar, is essentially a light beam that's used to construct a 3D representation of the Earth's surface and anything on that surface, like trees. So the JEDI data isn't quite this high resolution, but this just gives you a general idea about what's possible here and what we might how we might integrate these different data sources to try to understand really how birds vary across their range. Something like predation pressure might also play a substantial role in driving morphological variation. So again, to maneuverability, higher predator densities may impact traits such as wing length. Individuals may need to be more maneuverable to avoid avian predators. So certainly interested in exploring morphology as it relates to predator density. So we might get that from something like the eBird Status and Trends product, which provides a measure of the relative abundance of bird species across their ranges. So here we have the abundance of sharp-shinned hawk across their range. That's a predator of birds. And things like competition between other species on the same trophic level that could also play an important role in bird morphology. But really beyond that, we can also use this morphological information to try to understand the migratory connectivity for migratory species. So that is quantifying the linkages between the breeding and the non-breeding grounds, right? So this is a figure from Cohen et al. The line showing how the breeding grounds in the north are connected with the overwintering grounds in the south. So this particular study, I believe, is based on band recoveries, which is pretty great for ducks, but maybe not so great for a number of other species. So I'm interested in using these morphological measures to estimate connectivity. So these morphoscapes that quantify this spatial variation in morphology, they can actually be used to probabilistically link geographic areas over the breeding and non-breeding seasons. So for instance, areas on the breeding grounds where individuals may have longer wings, those are really likely to be linked to areas on the overwintering grounds where those populations also have longer wings. Kind of use that information to try to understand these migratory patterns. And this is really important for several reasons. Really, first, to contribute to our basic understanding about the migratory patterns of these species, whether they have a leapfrog migration, chain migration, telescopic migration. Here, the circles represent areas where a species might be breeding, where the triangles might represent areas where the species is overwintering. So there's all these different sorts of patterns that species might use depending on their biologies. For some species, we understand this fairly well, but for most, we really don't how prevalent each of these strategies are and why that might vary across species. So certainly a valuable tool for understanding that. But really beyond that also, I think trying to estimate connectivity, that really has the potential to identify distinct populations, including areas of local adaptation, which could have implication for conservation efforts. Intraspecific variation, that is variation within species, is this really important, but often underappreciated element of biodiversity. I think these estimates of connectivity can try to help us understand where vulnerable populations are breeding, overwintering, so we can prioritize conservation efforts for these at-risk populations, something that's, of course, critical in addressing the nearly 3 billion birds that we've lost across North America over the last several decades. We're very excited about sort of what we found so far, excited for this work to be out there in the scientific literature and the ethos. But there are also a ton of potential areas of exploration into the future. So exciting projects that are going to keep us busy. So stay tuned, I guess. I'd just like to acknowledge the MAPS team at IBP again, everyone over at IBP. Again, everybody that runs the MAPS banding stations. I know it's a huge effort. I don't know, thousands and thousands of effort that goes into that. This study wouldn't have been possible without those many hours. Big thanks to Lauren Houghton at IBP, who did the bird illustrations for this paper, for this presentation. Really stellar stuff. So thanks, Lauren. Thanks to UCLA for some funding, and UCLA and University of Connecticut for some compute resources. Again, I'm hoping to put this PDF up on my website as soon as it becomes available if you don't have access to the paper and you're interested in checking it out. Yeah, thank you all very much for listening, and I am happy to take any questions.
Okay, so I've got one question from Louisa in the chat. Could the inability of bird morphology to adapt to changing temperatures rapidly enough be a possible driver of range shifts to higher elevations and higher latitudes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So range shifts. We know that some species are certainly shifting their range, right? In this case, that was an initial concern that we had. Are birds actually, getting smaller at some of these sites, or are they just sort of shifting their ranges? But the fact that we see these changes over the entire range, especially most rapidly, really in the warmest parts of their ranges, indicates for us that it's not solely a signal of a shift there, that it is those populations that are shifting in size. But yes, range shifts are certainly another component by which these birds are responding to these changes, but independent of this.
Great. While we're waiting for more questions, or I have a question. Did you guys look at different niches of birds, like aerial insectivores versus gleaners versus, like, if that has any effect on morphology changes, or no?
No, we haven't looked at that yet, but it's a good question. Yeah, I think there are a lot of things where different species level traits, where some species might vary quite a lot by habitat type, or they might be responding differently over time because of the way that they the way that they forage, or the particular habitat types that they're found in. Yeah, I think that's all open questions and all super interesting, but we just don't know yet.
We have a question from Olivia. She says, fantastic talk. Thank you. What do you think are some of the best steps individuals could take to support birds in a rapidly warming world? And what policies are you hoping our elected representatives might tackle after the upcoming midterms?
Wow, yeah, a lot there, right? Um, well, I guess it's a multi-pronged problem. Part of this is the large-scale climate change problem, where we need to address climate change. That's a very big problem. It's not just about birds, it's about everything. So it's about reducing carbon emissions. That, of course, is a component of this. But that's a very difficult problem if we want to try to parse it down and say, okay, well, what can we do for these birds specifically? Well, I think we need to understand where the pressures on these species are. So maybe it means doing a better effort of conserving important habitat types. And really, I think with some of this, when we get a better idea of sort of migratory connectivity and things like that, which I think we can use this morphological information to do, I think that could actually be quite informative regarding, like, okay, these are the specific populations within species that are not doing great. Let's try to actually conserve land, these migratory corridors for these species. So I think that is really the targeted information, targeted actions that we could take. But the big picture, yeah, I think it's a lot about climate change. It's a very complex problem, unfortunately.
Understandable. All right. Ken asked, is it possible that climate and/or habitat changes on wintering grounds might result in morphology change through shorter migrations? And how could you tease out which is cause and which is effect?
Yeah, so the overwintering period, yeah, birds spend a lot of time on their overwintering grounds, not just on their breeding grounds. So it's definitely going to be important there. I think any shift in where they're overwintering, we could see that potentially, using the Mosey data, maybe. It's a tricky thing, I think, trying to understand both the spatial and temporal changes there. But thus far, we have entirely ignored the overwintering period, which is no doubt important. Yeah, land cover change could be important. If there's sparser forests, maybe those species have longer wings because they don't need to be as maneuverable. Maybe that's confounded with the effect that sort of migratory distance might have. They're tricky questions, and I think we need to think more about that. But that's sort of the next step, is trying to take a look at the overwintering grounds. What's going on there? How do those effects compare to the patterns we see on the breeding grounds, and trying to integrate and sort of reconcile those things.
Okay. We have a question from Johannes. There was one diagram which showed how bird sizes decreased over time, but there was one species that increased dramatically. Do you know which one that was and why it increased? Greetings from Germany, and thanks for the webinar.
Yeah. Well, thanks for logging on. That is painted bunting, and why we see that, I don't know. And that's one thing that I'm very interested to know more about. I've taken a closer look at that species. And yeah, there are a couple sites there where the size is dramatically changing for that particular species. And that might be one case where, yeah, there's some, immigration that's going on from another population with very different morphology. And maybe it's just, injecting this with an incredibly rapid increase in size over time. So yeah, it's painted bunting, and I don't have a good explanation for that, but it is a very interesting signal.
Cool. So Inez was wondering about the relationship between size and temperature in humans, and does it play out the same as in birds? And have you looked at any anthropological data?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I haven't, but it's it's an interesting question. We as humans, of course, we're pretty good at devising all these ways and tools, furs and clothes to cope with our environment. But yeah, I haven't looked at it, but yeah, I'd be very interested to talk to some anthropologists about that. It's a good question.
Cool. Louisa was wondering what role might prolonged drought be playing in these morphology changes, because the Intermountain West and Southwest have been experiencing a decades-long drought. So
Yeah, definitely. So in these very hot environments, especially desert environments, water plays a real important role in thermal regulation. So there's been some papers I know about focused, I think it was Death Valley or somewhere, desert California. Yeah, essentially showing that it's a combination of increasing temperature as well as decreased water availability. So I definitely think that droughts could sort of exacerbate the effects of these warming temperatures on the thermal pressures for these birds. So yeah, it's a really good point.
cool. Ken Burton was wondering about the painted bunting issues.
Mhm.
Could larger painted buntings be less subject to the cage bird trade for some reason, less catchable or less desirable?
Yeah, I don't know. Actually, I don't really know a lot about the sort of painted bunting trade, but yeah, it's a good hypothesis. Yeah, I'm not really sure.
Okay. So we can hang out for a couple minutes and see if anybody has any more questions that pop into their head. But
Cool.
that was really great webinar. I really appreciate it, Casey and Kate,
Yeah,
put
thanks
that together.
for
It's
sure.
really fun to see the maps data used in new and exciting ways.
Definitely. Well, it's fun to explore the maps data because there's so much there. Yeah, it's such a cool resource.